All right, so we started another project, and this one is called Daily Share. And what this is, it's basically a website that we're going to create using an API. So in Scrimbo, we're using the Hacker News API, but I'm not entirely sure what API I'll use. And what we are basically doing here is just setting up all of our pages and building the structure of our site. So starting off, I made my index.html page and we created basically this header component. And then we created this route container. And what this route container is going to contain is the information that the users are going to view. And we named it route container in route outlet because we're using this package called Navigo from NPM, which I think is going to serve kind of like React, where when we click on links and we navigate through pages, it'll automatically load them up. I'm not entirely sure yet because I'm not there yet. And another thing is that these hrefs here are using the $, the hash symbol, and the /. So this just means home directory right here. This is the new page, ask, show, and favorites. And we're also using a type of module since we're using our utility folders for using different folders to kind of keep our JavaScript code more organized. So what we did first was that we went ahead and we created our app.js, and we entered router handler, and that's going to be explained later. But we basically just made a class app and had a constructor and basically passed through a new router. So where are we getting this router, you might ask? We're getting it from our not stories.js, router.js. And on our routers.js, we're basically using the router. So const router is going to equal to a new Navigo. And this Navigo is just the NPM script that we specified here. And it's going to let us do some special things with our default class and with our paths. So this code of Navigo is basically just saying make an instance of Navigo. So everything starts with the hash in Navigo, hence why we have the hashtag for all of these links. And we're basically making a default class called router handler. And inside of this class, we have a constructor, which is basically just calling this method of create routes. And the create routes is going to contain a const of routes, which is basically just an array of different objects, and each object constitutes to the page we are trying to get into. So we have the path of /, which just means the home directory, and then the page that loads up is going to be stories. And we imported stories from stories.js, and basically all stories is doing is making a function called stories, and we're exporting it so that we can get it in our router.js. In our view in our HTML is basically just going to constitute to the path. So I'll explain that later because we imported our view from view.js, and all view.js is getting the document query selector and selecting the router outlet. So this is what the user will get to see. And our stories.js is basically just printing the path of the page that we're on. So if we go back to router.js, we see that we run a for each method. So this for each method is basically taking each of these routes and it's going to iterate over each of those routes. And then we destructure the objects that are inside of the route, so the path and the page, and we basically run the method router on. So router on is going to basically render what we want to see on the page. So the first argument it takes is the path, of course, because it needs to know which page it's on. So whether it's on the new, ask, or show page. And then it takes a callback function. And this callback function is going to run the page, which is the stories, which we're getting from the stories function, and we're exporting it into our router. And it's basically going to take the page, which is the stories. And since this is a function, we pass through the argument of path. And the argument of path, of course, goes here, and it constitutes the path that we're getting from these paths. And then at the end, we want to go ahead and resolve it. And what resolve is saying is basically like, hey, go ahead and run this. So when we go back to our page, we see that we're at top, and that's the home directory. And when we go to new, we get /new because that is the new directory, hence the #/new. So we get ask, show, and then favorites was not added in. One thing that I also did differently about this project is that I split my style.css pages into different pages as well. So I have my reset CSS, and this is going to hold my reset values. I have my colors.css, which is going to hold all of my vars, so my white, blue, black, and pale white, and then my selection color. So when I go ahead and select over daily or share, it turns white. And then I have all of the code for my header component. So this is this component that you see up here. So I thought I would try splitting my CSS files into different components so that when I go back and try to modify my CSS, it's much easier to manage. So I think that's a pretty good basic explanation of what's going on here. Obviously, there's probably more nuances that I didn't explain, but I just wanted to have this kind of as a reference. And one more thing that I want to explain here is that since we export our default class of router handler, and since what's happening here in create routes is that we are basically loading the page depending on the path. When we go into our app.js, we want to call the new router handler from router handler that we exported, and we want to go ahead and instantiate it. And that basically means, hey, I want you to run this router handlers class. And the router handlers class, of course, it's going to go ahead and run this method called create routes, and it's going to load up all of the different paths or routes that we see when we click on the different links. So that's pretty much it for that video.